The Pacific Ocean, 1942. 6 months have passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Empire of Japan reigns supreme. From the jungles of Southeast Asia to the remote islands of the Pacific, the rising sun flag flies over a vast new empire, one with shocking speed and brutal efficiency. The Allied forces are in retreat, their navies shattered, their armies reeling. Japan's carrier fleet, the mighty Kedo Butai, seems invincible, an unstoppable force that has swept aside all opposition. For the United States, the situation is dire. Hope is a dwindling resource. But in a quiet, windowless basement in Hawaii, a small team of codebreakers is fighting a different kind of war. Their battlefield is a complex grid of numbers and symbols. Their weapons are pencils, paper, and sheer intellect. They are listening to the enemy's most secret conversations. And they've just intercepted a message that could change the course of history. The Japanese are planning another major attack, one designed to lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a final, decisive battle and annihilate them. The target is a tiny, 2-square-mile, atoll codenamed AF. The fate of the war hinges on one question: where is AF? Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, had to make an impossible choice. His intelligence chief, Commander Joseph Rochefort, was convinced AF was Midway Atoll, a vital American outpost. Washington, however, disagreed, believing the target was in the South Pacific, or even the U.S. West Coast. Trusting his gut and his codebreakers, Nimitz gambled everything. In a brilliant act of counter-espionage on Midway, was ordered to send an unencrypted radio message, falsely reporting that its freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Days later, Rochefort's team intercepted a Japanese message: AF is short on water. The trap was set. The target was confirmed. Nimitz now knew where the Japanese would strike. But knowing was only half the battle. The force Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was sending was overwhelming. Over 150 ships, including 4 of the very same aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor: Kagi, Kaga Soryu, and Haryu. Against this armada, Nimitz could only muster 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had been crippled just a month earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor performed a miracle, getting Yorktown patched up and battle-ready in just 72 hours, a job that should have taken 3 months. The odds were still terrifyingly long. American naval doctrine was outmatched, its torpedoes were faulty, and many of its pilots were inexperienced. This wasn't a fair fight. It was an ambush, where the ambushed had to somehow turn the tables on a vastly superior foe. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the first wave of Japanese bombers descended upon Midway. The island's defenders fought back with incredible bravery. Marine pilots and outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters flew headlong into swarms of superior Japanese Zeros. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black puffs of flak. While Midway's defenses were battered, they held. Crucially, the island's airstrip remained operational. The Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, received reports from his strike leader. Midway was damaged, but not knocked out. A second strike would be necessary to neutralize the base and prepare for the planned invasion. At that moment, Nagumo faced a critical decision. His planes on deck were armed with torpedoes, ready for any American ships that might appear. But his pilots were telling him they needed bombs to finish off Midway. Following doctrine, Nagumo gave the order: rearm the planes, remove the torpedoes, and replace them with land attack bombs. This was a slow, laborious process. On the crowded hangar decks of the Japanese carriers, crews began wrestling with 1,000-pound munitions. Torpedoes were wheeled away, and bombs were brought forward. It was a moment of organized chaos, a moment of extreme vulnerability. Just as the rearming was underway, a Japanese scout plane, delayed by a catapult malfunction, sent a shocking message, sighted what appears to be an enemy carrier. Nagumo was stunned. The Americans weren't supposed to be here. Intelligence had assured him they were thousands of miles away. Panic set in. He had just ordered his planes armed with bombs for a land attack, but now an enemy fleet was on the horizon. Nagumo gave another fateful order: halt the rearming, change back to torpedoes. Bombs that had been loaded were now being removed. The hangar decks became a tangled mess of fuel lines, ordnance carts, and confused men. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked precariously on the deck, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. It was during this window of chaos and indecision that the first American planes arrived. They came in waves, a desperate, almost suicidal series of attacks. Torpedo bombers from the Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown flew in low and slow, without fighter protection. They were sitting ducks for the nimble Japanese Zero fighters and the carrier's anti-aircraft guns. One by one, they were annihilated. Of the 41 torpedo planes that took part in these initial attacks, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo found its mark. The sacrifice seemed to be in vain. But it wasn't. Their heroic, doomed charge had achieved something vital. It had pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the Zero fighters, down to sea level to slaughter the low-flying torpedo planes. This left the skies directly above the Japanese fleet wide open. And at that exact moment, at 10:22 a.m., high above the chaos, another group of American planes arrived, unseen and unheard. They were the dauntless dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown. Led by Lieutenant Commanders Wade McCluskey and Max Leslie, they had arrived at the perfect time, from the perfect height. Looking down, they saw what no American had seen since the war began. The 4 Japanese carriers, their decks cluttered with planes and ordnance, turning into the wind to launch their own strike. For the American pilots, it was the sight of a lifetime. The Japanese fleet was completely exposed. McCluskey and his pilots tipped their planes over and began their near-vertical dives. Screaming down from 15,000 feet, the Japanese sailors looked up in horror. There was no time to react. Within 5 minutes, the tide of the Pacific War was turned. Bombs slammed into the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. They tore through flight decks, packed with fueled and armed aircraft. The carelessly stacked ordnance in the hangars began to cook off, setting off a chain reaction of catastrophic explosions. The pride of the Japanese Navy was transformed into 3 gigantic, blazing funeral pyres. In less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee, 3 of Japan's finest carriers were burning wrecks. Only one Japanese carrier, the Haryu, remained. Undaunted, its commander launched a swift and furious counterattack. Hiryu's bombers found the American carrier Yorktown and, despite a valiant defense, managed to land 3 direct hits. Yorktown was grievously wounded, dead in the water and burning fiercely. Believing they had avenged their sister ships, the Harry's pilots returned to rearm for another strike. But the Americans were not done. Scouts from the now crippled Yorktown had located the Haryu, a final strike force. A composite group of dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown itself was launched. They found the lone Japanese carrier and repeated the deadly performance from that morning. 4 bombs struck the Hiryu, leaving it an inferno. By sunset on June 4th, all 4 of Yamamoto's powerful carriers were at the bottom of the Pacific, or doomed to sink. Along with the ships, Japan lost over 250 aircraft and, most devastatingly, more than 3,000 men. Including a huge number of its most experienced and irreplaceable veteran pilots, the United States lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, which was finally sunk by a Japanese submarine 2 days later while under tow, along with 1 destroyer and around 300 men. The Battle of Midway was an astounding victory, a triumph of intelligence, courage, and incredible luck. It permanently shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific. Japan's offensive capabilities were shattered, and they would spend the rest of the war on the defensive. The seemingly invincible Japanese war machine had been stopped dead in its tracks. The path to victory was still long and bloody, but Midway had turned the tide. It was the moment the Huntod became the hunter, a pivotal victory that changed the world. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories from the past.